Okay, so I've got an hour to talk to you. Don't worry, I'm not going to speak for the whole hour. I'll probably talk for about half an hour on the main fellowship program that we run, and also the clinical academic training program, and a couple of others. So I won't cover absolutely every fellowship program we do. I'll give you an overview of what there is, and if you've got any specific questions on some of the smaller schemes, I'd be happy to talk to you about those afterwards. But then, I say I should have time for about 20 minutes or so questions at the end anyway. So I'm sure most of you know what the NIHR is. It's established in 2006 as a way of implementing the government strategy for applied health research. And we currently have about a £1 billion annual budget, of which just over £100 million of that is on research training. So that's mainly through the various fellowship programs that I'm about to talk about now. In terms of what we fund, this is what the NIHR remit is, and anyone who's proposing to submit an application to one of our fellowships, it has to fall within this remit. So the first stage of any application, when you submit it to the NIHR, is a check that you fall within this remit. I mean, the Research Design Service understand this remit well, so if you're going to them, I think you can be sure that you are going to fit within that. But we do say that if you're unsure, talk to us as well. We're happy to discuss sort of any ideas you might have about whether you think it fits within the remit before applying. And it does make sense to do that before going to the effort of filling in the form, because any of you who've applied before will know it's quite a hefty form. So it's disappointing to have to go through all that only to find out it's not within remit, which is something we can usually decide quite quickly if you talk to us initially. I mean, probably the most important point on there, I'd say, is it has to show potential to benefit patients in the public within 5 years of its completion. That's the key point, really. That's just that slide really sort of showing you where the NIHR remit fits within the innovation pathway, sort of over from what the Medical Research Council fund all the way through to implementation within the NHS. So it is quite a wide remit, but say it is important that you understand what it is before applying. And just a slide really to show the structure of the NIHR, just for a bit of background. We see it as a whole system. It's not just a funder of fellowships or just a funder of research. It covers fellowships, which is through the faculty. If you were successful in getting a fellowship, you would become an NIHR trainee, which is part of our faculty. There's also funding through research through the various programs, Research for Patient Benefit program grants, 2 examples. But we also have funding for infrastructure, so this is things like biomedical research units, biomedical research centres, and systems to support that, so IT systems, research management systems, etc. So this slide is really to summarise everything that is available through the NIHR Trainees Coordinating Centre. So I'm not going to cover every one of these because that would take quite a while, but the main ones I'm going to cover today are the main fellowships programmes, which is these ones here. The clinical academic training programme for nurses, midwives and AHPs, although there is some fairly significant changes coming to that, which I will talk about, and also the NIHR Clinician Scientist Award I'm going to talk about as well. We do have other programmes, which I'm not going to mention, but say if anyone's got any questions on any of these. Okay, so the first one I'm going to talk about is the fellowships programme. So the NIHR Fellowships Programme has been around since before NIHR started. Actually, it was the previous incarnations of this have been around since about 2001, when it was funded through DHR&D. As it stands now, we now have 5 levels of award, from doctoral research fellowships all the way up to senior research fellowships. And since 2013, we also have this NIHR Transitional Research Fellowship. So the NIHR Fellowships Programme is open to anyone from any professional background. It's not restricted to only clinical. It's open to anyone. The main thing is you have to be proposing research that falls within the NIHR remit, which I showed you earlier. All levels of the fellowship programme cover your salary, so that's your full salary. Full tuition fees if you're applying for a PhD through the Doctoral Research Fellowship. Research costs, so things like consumables, equipment, etc. There is certain limits on bits of that within the different fellowships, but that's all detailed within the finance guidance note. Full training and development costs, so you can include costs for going on things like conferences, but also attending courses which will benefit you and your through the period of your research, but also beyond the end of your fellowship. They're all 3 years in duration, and they can be done part-time as well. There is part-time options of either 75% or 60%, and the SRF is 5 years, and that's regardless of whether it's done full-time or part-time. You can be based at a HEI or in an NHS body, but we've changed our guidance, which when we next launch, you can actually also be based in any organisation which supports NHS services or delivers NHS services, just in recognition that more and more NHS services actually are delivered outside the NHS. It's an annual competition, and the next round is due to open autumn 2014, but we're looking towards the end of October, so probably the last week of October is when the forms and guidance will go live on the NIHR website. So a bit more detail about the various levels. So the Doctoral Research Fellowship for people wanting to undertake a PhD. It's 3 years in duration. In terms of what the panel are going to be looking for from the applicant here, it's someone who's probably got some previous research experience, but obviously it's applying to do a PhD, so they're not looking for loads here. It's mostly about potential. In terms of what candidates look like, the ones that are successful have usually got some sort of master's level experience of research. It's not to say that you have to have a master's, because plenty of people do come in without a master's and are successful, but it's some previous research experience. If you came in with none at all, I think you wouldn't be that competitive, so it's some previous research experience. This might include some outputs, so if you've maybe done a research project as part of a master's course, potentially you might have some outputs from that. And they're starting to see, I say it's potential, but commitment to a research career, so evidence that this is actually what you want to do for your career. You want to undertake a career in research. The Postdoctoral Research Fellowship, again, is 3 years in duration. You have to have either submitted your PhD or MD when you apply, or have had it awarded. If you've had it submitted when you apply, we ask for evidence that it's been awarded prior to you coming to interview, should you be invited to interview. So by the time you get to interview, it must have been awarded, but at a minimum, submitted when you apply. A bit more output from research now. This is obviously an early postdoctoral fellowship, so not reams and reams of papers and grant applications, but some evidence now, mostly probably from your PhD, obviously taking into account that if you've only just submitted your PhD, you might not have yet had publications from it, but a bit more output, and again, evidence that this is what you want to do as your career. The next level up is the Career Development Fellowship. So the next level of postdoctoral award, more senior now. This is for people who've got up to 7 years postdoctoral research experience. This can be working time equivalent as well, so it's not 7 years from date of award of PhD. If you've taken a career break during that time, or you've worked clinically, so you've only been doing 50% research, 50% clinical, that's taken into consideration. So it's 7 years working time equivalent post-PhD. For the next round of fellowships, which we're launching in October, there is going to be a bit of additional flexibility given to that, up to 8 years for people who've had a career break during that time, but the guidance on that is going to be detailed within the guidance notes when we launch. In terms of what the panel are looking for now, it's more significant output from research, so both from your doctoral studies and any postdoctoral experience you've had already, and starting to develop increasing independence now, and showing signs of being able to develop the research careers of others as well. So you may have now started to develop your own research team. The next level is the Senior Research Fellowship, so our most senior fellowship that we do. This is for anyone who's basically not yet got a chair. Quite a lot of the Senior Research Fellows gain a chair during the course of their fellowship, but you can't have one when you apply. So at this point, we are now looking for significant postdoctoral experience. So there's no limit on it, apart from not having a chair. An outstanding publication record and evidence of gaining further funding through grant applications. You are now are either an independent researcher or say just about there, and showing leadership potential in your field. So it is the most senior one, and it is quite a competitive award, and not one that we fund that many of. So the round that's just gone, for example, we didn't fund any, and the previous year it was 2. So it sort of gives you an idea of the sort of the level of that one. And the last one to mention is the Transitional Research Fellowship. So we launched this for the first time in round 6 in 2013, And this was primarily aimed at people who have had a, say, research career in basic science, but want to make a transition into the type of research that NIHR fund. But it could also be used for people who are maybe returning from a career break and have identified very specific training and development needs that they want to use the fellowship for. This fellowship looks slightly different to the others. It's shorter, it's only 2 years in duration. It's a postdoctoral fellowship, and it does have a very significant training and development element to it. It should include a research project as part of that training and development, but the idea is it will take you from a position where you probably wouldn't have been competitive for something like a career development fellowship to, on completion of it, somewhere where you would be competitive. But the important thing with this is even though if you might be coming from a sort of a place where you're quite experienced in basic science, the actual research you're proposing to do as part of your project must fall within the NIHR remit, and it must be clear at the end of the fellowship that you're in a position to be able to do further NIHR remit research, say through a career development fellowship. Because we had quite a lot of applications to this in the last round who had applied from a basic science background and hadn't quite understood the remit, so were unfortunately ineligible due to their not meeting the NIHR remit. So it is important that you understand that if applying to this one. Just to give you an idea of the figures, so you can see the last round we had 367 applications, the breakdown there across the various levels. It has been a steady increase since it was launched in its current form in 2008. We had a bit of a peak in 2012, but since then it's sort of a similar sort of level. Just to give you an idea of who applies for one of these, I said it's open to any professional background. We do see quite a lot of applications from medics and also non-healthcare professionals, but a good spread as well from nurses, midwives, dentists, allied health professionals and other healthcare professionals, which is mainly clinical psychologists, pharmacists, healthcare scientists. In terms of what success rates look like within that, you have to take this with a pinch of salt, because you can see in, I think it was 2008, the dentist did really well, but surprisingly there was only one person who applied that year and they got it. So. But yeah, there's a bit of variation. You can see it's sort of in the similar ballpark no matter what profession you get, and obviously a bit more variation when the numbers are smaller. So the next one I'm going to talk about is the Clinical Academic Training Programme for Nurses, Midwives and AHPs, as it's currently called. When we next launch this, it will be called something else, but the structure of it will look like it does here. So I can talk about it as it looks here. That won't change. It's going to take on a different name. And the reason for that is this programme is funded slightly differently from our standard fellowships programme in that it's funded by Health Education England. And Health Education England have been reviewing this programme alongside the programme for healthcare scientists. And what they've been wanting to do is try to expand the number of professions that can apply to this programme. So those of you who know anything about the Clinical Academic Training Programme in the past know it's been open only to nurses, midwives and anyone who's classed as an AHP, Mental Health Care Professions Council. The new scheme in its new form is going to be more encompassing of all registered professionals who are non-medics or non-dentists. Medics and dentists have their own programme, the Integrated Academic Training Programme, which includes clinician scientists, academic clinical fellows and clinical lecturers. Not one I'm going to go into too much detail about today. So this is supposed to cover everyone else who's a healthcare professional who wants to undertake a clinical academic career. So the full list of professions that's going to be eligible to this will be going live on our website, hopefully very soon. It's going to be linking to the Health Education England website. They've not quite finalised that list, but it hopefully should be up any day now. It will look just the same in terms of what awards are available. So it will still include a master's level, a doctoral level, and 2 clinical lectureship levels. So that's not going to change. It's really just who can apply, what profession you are, as to who can apply. So I'll talk about as it looks now, but as I say, this isn't really going to change. So the first level is the master's programme, and these master's courses are funded through currently these institutions in England. So they apply to NIHR to host these master's courses. Successful institutions are awarded funding for these courses. So anyone interested in doing a master's in clinical research funded by NIHR would apply to one of these institutions themselves. You wouldn't apply to us. The next level is the Clinical Doctoral Research Fellowship, which looks very much like the Doctoral Research Fellowship through the General Fellowships Programme. The main difference being here, it's a Clinical Doctoral Research Fellowship, so within that, whatever period of time, whether full-time, part-time, you're doing your research, there's also a period of time that you're allowed to do clinical work as well. It should be clinical development, so the panel want to see you developing your research skills and your clinical skills side by side. So it's not just doing your research and keeping some clinical going, it's about developing both side by side. So that's the main difference between the two. Same sort of eligibility criteria apply. You have to be based within an English NHS organisation or provider of NHS services or a HEI. Because this is a clinical one, they do expect you to have 1 year clinical experience since completion. So for a nurse, for example, 1 year since you've been awarded your nursing degree. And say both the academic and clinical parts are equally of importance. So it's important to make sure you've got a good clinical supervisor as well as the correct academic support. Costs are just the same, so research costs, salary, PhD fees, etc. The next launch for this one in its new form and its new name will be towards the end of February, beginning of March 2015. The next two levels, the two postdoctoral levels, are clinical lectureship and senior clinical lectureship. Both of these are 50-50 research to NHS service clinical development. So we just fund the research side, and the institution or organisation where you're going to be doing your clinical work should fund the other. So it's important to have a good partnership established between your academic host and your clinical host when applying for one of these. It is something the panel look at very closely, how well links between the two have been established, how good that partnership is. Are you going to be supported as a clinical academic going forward? Other than that, it's similar things to the main fellowship programme. The clinical lectureship level is the more junior of the two, so some output of research experience. And then the senior clinical lectureship, obviously more senior, so a bit more output, starting to move towards independence, etc. The clinical lectureship is for people who have less than 5 years working time equivalent postdoctoral research. The senior lectureship is open-ended, but again, it's like the senior research fellowship. You can't already have a chair when you apply, and you must have at least 5 years clinical experience since being registered as well. Just to give you an idea on the numbers of this, so they're not quite as high as the main fellowships programme, although I expect as it's expanded to more professions, we probably will see this number increase next year. So last year in round 4, we had 62 applications, 20 awards, 6 awards in the clinical lectureship, and 1 award to the senior clinical lectureship. So senior clinical lectureship, senior research fellowship, similar sort of levels. You can see quite small numbers awarded. It's quite a competitive fellowship. Just to give you an idea of the numbers, breakdown of the professions that we've funded so far. So you can see the majority is through the master's courses, but just over 50 clinical doctor research fellows, smaller numbers of CLs and SCLs. And in terms of professions, the majority just AHPs, so obviously quite a few nurses, a small number of midwives. That obviously will look different when we expand to further professions. So the last award I'm going to mention is the NIHR Clinician Scientist Award. This is open to doctors and dentists and is part of the integrated academic training programme. This looks quite similar to the postdoctoral awards within our fellowships programme. The main difference again with this one is similar to how the clinical doctor research fellowship and the doctoral research fellowship are the same but different, is the clinical element. So for a Clinician Scientist Award, as well as doing your research, you can also do up to 4 sessions, NHS clinical sessions, as part of the award. So medics and dentists are often more attracted to this one compared to, say, a postdoctoral fellowship or a career development fellowship, because it includes that provision to do clinical service within it. It's 5 years in duration. You can apply either pre or post CCT. If you apply pre-CCT, that clinical service time can be bigger. So it's whatever is appropriate to reach your CCT. But on gaining CCT, we'd expect you to drop down to up to 4 NHS sessions. As with the other awards, it includes cost for salary, research costs, training and development, etc. It also includes cost for a research assistant for 3 years within that 5 years. In terms of what the applicant would look like, it's a postdoctoral award, so same as the others, you have to have had your PhD either awarded or submitted when you apply, evidence of commitment to a research career, and there's also an expectation that you're going to be employed for your organisation going forward. So it's the expectation that you will be supported beyond the duration of your fellowship. The next launch for this one is going to be around April of next year. So that's it for the details about the applications. The next few slides I'm going to give now are sort of hints and tips from the panel and from what we've seen over the years from our experience. So in terms of when you actually come to make an application, it's very important to understand the process. So coming to things like this is a good way of getting an overview of that. But we do have very detailed guidance notes for all these programs, and we do spend quite a lot of time making sure these guidance notes are correct. And I know there's many people who apply who probably don't read them or don't read them in detail, but there is important guidance in there which will help you make a better quality application, tell you what we're looking for from each of the questions. So it can be quite long and not the most exciting of reads, but it is important that you read them fully before making an application. So talk to us before you apply. So it's, you know, whatever question you may have, we're happy to always go through it with you on the phone. There's several program managers that work at the Trainees Coordinating Centre that are happy to advise on any of these training schemes. REMIT especially, if you've got queries about REMIT, please talk to us before starting this process. Look at previous award holders is a good thing to do. We've got a list on our website which lists everyone who's had one of these awards in the past. So you can get a good idea of if there's anyone locally that you could go and talk to who's been through the process. I'm sure they'd be happy to be approached. So, you know, what was it like for you? But also it gives you a good understanding of the types of research we fund. So if you're a bit unsure about the REMIT, seeing what we funded in the past can help you understand that. You can also look who's on the panel, as I say, to get an idea of the kind of people who are going to be assessing you, and say the topics that we've funded before. Peer reviewing before you submit is very important. I think even before you start actually filling in the application form itself, once you've started to develop your research proposal, it's good to get it reviewed by as many people as possible. Your potential supervisor, current award holders, your colleagues, senior academics, people from outside your field. I think the more you can get, the more perspective you can get, the better it will be. In terms of what we're looking for in the application, is to say it's quite a big application form. If any of you have ever submitted one before, a completed application form looks sort of 80 to 100 pages long when it's finished. It is quite hefty, although we have been doing some work to try and cut that down this year, which you'll be glad to hear. The main areas it's looking for, though, can be split between these 4 different categories. Similar to any other funder of fellowships, if anyone's heard talks from funders like MRC or Wellcome, we tend to say person, project, place, which is what the extra one we've got in here is, which distinguishes a little bit more, is the training part. But in terms of the person, it's the trajectory of that person, obviously dependent on the level, as I talked about previously, and their career outputs, again, depending on the level. In terms of the research itself, obviously we're looking at the person, but the research is of equal importance. It has to be high scientific quality. It has to be the appropriate scale and the appropriate scope. So a doctoral research fellowship, for example, someone who's proposing to come and do a full RCT, probably not appropriate for a doctoral research fellowship. Doctoral research fellowships and postdoctoral fellowships, if you're thinking of getting into clinical trials, something like a feasibility study may be more appropriate for that level of award. But think about what's achievable within the time frame and scope of a fellowship. In terms of training, that's important to address that in any of these applications, whether it's for a doctoral one, where the training may seem obvious what you need for the fellowship and going forwards, all the way through to the senior research fellowship. The panel will still be looking that you've got a robust training and development program, even at senior research level. This may include things like leadership training, for example, but it's important that it's there in every level of award. And the host environment. The panel will look at the host environment to make sure it has a track record in the area that you're applying to, that you're going to be appropriately supported, and also do the supervisors and mentors that you've chosen, do they have the right experience for what you want to do, but also the available right amount of time to commit to you. You may have picked some world leader in a particular field, but if they can only see you for 5 minutes every month, that might not be appropriate for a fellowship supervisor. It's important to consider all the options. Depending on what your background is, there may be several different fellowships that I've talked about that you could apply for, especially if you're from a clinical background, you've probably got more options there. So it's important to understand which one might be the best for you, both in terms of what the awards look like, but timing-wise, etc. So come and talk to us at the office if you're unsure. Develop a proposal well ahead of the deadline. I think most people say who've been successful, they've actually spent up to a year preparing this, although the closing date for fellowships is, say the next one is January 2015, and the forms won't go live until later in October. Most people who are going to apply will know they're going to apply, will have developed the research well ahead of that. They'll have established who's going to be their supervisor, they'll have talked to their host institution, they'll have talked to the RDS. I don't know, everyone who's here today, obviously I think you're going to be doing that because you've come to an event such as this, but the earlier you can do these things, the better. One thing jump to the last one, even talking to people well ahead of time, this includes whoever's going to be doing your finances. The finance form is quite a complicated part of the form, and I know there's many finance leads who've told us they often get people coming to them the day before the deadline saying, oh, can you come and fill in my finances? That probably won't always be appreciated by whoever's doing that if you come to them that late in the day. It's important to talk to them as early as possible. It is quite complicated to get the finances right, and if they're not right, one, it can hinder your application, but if you were to be awarded, it can take longer to set up the contract at that stage as well, because we have to make sure the finances are correct before issuing a contract. So talk to your finance lead early. And all these other people, I say it's important to get advice from them and talk to them early. Your supervisor, anyone who you're hoping to collaborate with as part of your award, your mentor, the methodologists, etc. In terms of the project, it's important, it's going to be a relevant question. So the quality of the science is equally important in terms of you as a person. So make sure that you've reviewed the relevant literature, make sure you've made clear what the impact of your research is going to be. So it is about potential to benefit patients and the public within 5 years of completion. So obviously some projects are easier to show that than others, but whatever you're researching, it's important to try and show the impact of that, even if it's mostly methodology-based research, the impact is important to include. Ensure the methods are sound, so depending on the level and depending on your background, you may have more or less experience in the research methods you're going to be using. If they are new to you, it's important that you've got the right support behind you. So if you're doing a doctoral level fellowship, for example, and you've got some methods in there that you don't have much experience from, make sure one of your supervisors at least is an expert in that field, because the panel won't expect you to know and understand everything that you're going to be doing. I mean, that's why you're doing the fellowship, but they will expect you to have the right support there and it to be obvious that you're going to be supported and learn through the course of the fellowship. I've mentioned this a few times, but the fit within the remit is very important. And it might seem an obvious one, but spell check before you submit. I know it winds panel members up when they have to review an application that's littered with spelling mistakes, because it does occur, and if you're starting to wind them up just because of that, it puts them in a bad frame of mind when they're actually reading your application. So simple thing to do, but make sure you spell check it before you submit. And the signatures, although it's not signatures as it used to be anymore because we submit electronically, people who are named as signatories still need to approve your application online before the deadline, before it's accepted as being complete. So although they won't have to be in the same place to actually physically sign the form anymore, they will still need access to a computer to be able to do that. So make sure they know that they're going to be required to do that and when they're going to be required to do that by. Because as I said, you can't miss the deadline. It is a fixed deadline, usually at 1 o'clock on the relevant day. Even if it's 5 minutes over that, you won't be able to submit the application. So it's important that you don't miss that. In terms of the interview, if you're successful and get called for interview, the first thing to do is practice. Again, similar to what I said about getting your application peer reviewed, it's important to get practice before you come to interview. The more, the better. Most people say that mock interviews are usually the worst. I know the tactic that many supervisors take is to give someone who's coming for an interview a good grilling before they actually come to us. Our panels are actually generally quite nice, and we'll be nice and friendly. So I think if you've had quite a nasty mock interview beforehand, it'll probably put you in a good shape before you come to us. You'll be asked to do a presentation It'll usually be 5 minutes in duration. The panel chair will be quite strict with that and will cut you off after 5 minutes, so make sure you've practiced the presentation and you're not going to go over time. And don't have loads and loads of slides in there. I think my advice would be to keep it simple but get across the key points that you want to do. In terms of what the panel are expecting from you when you go in there, I think it's fair to say they probably expect you to be nervous. It's a room of 14 professors who are going to be questioning you on your research, so understandably you're going to be nervous, and so don't worry if you are. But obviously they probably don't want to see you as a gibbering wreck. They want you to be able to answer the questions, but they will expect you to be nervous. So try and be confident, but not too overconfident. I think you do get people who are maybe get quite defensive when being questioned by the panel, but I think it's important to try and see it as a bit of a two-way process. The panel members actually usually are genuinely interested in the research which they're reviewing, so they may ask you, have you thought about this, have you thought about that, or suggest changes to your fellowship within the course of the interview. And it's important to take that on board and think how you might respond to that feedback should you be awarded the fellowship. And probably easier to say than actually do, but try and relax and be yourself. The panel members do like to see a bit of you coming across, because obviously it's funding the research, but it's also funding the individual. And if they can see some of your enthusiasm for what you're proposing to do, some of your personality, it certainly goes a long way to helping you in be successful in the interview. It's important to know the project inside out, obviously. You may, depending on level, have had quite a lot of help putting the project together, but it's important that you own the project. Obviously, you're the only one who's being interviewed. You could be questioned on any part of it. It's important you know it inside out. And that includes all the methods. As I mentioned before, you might be doing some research methodology that you've not really used in the past, but it's important you understand it enough to be able to answer questions on that. And think through alternatives. You might get questioned on, okay, what happens if this doesn't work or that doesn't work? Think where else your research might go. Obviously, it's unlikely to be the case that it'll follow exactly the plan that you've outlined in your application. Think about how you might address that in an interview situation if things don't work out. You'll be questioned on your training and development as well as your research. So think through your training needs, both in terms of the training you would need to complete the research within a fellowship, but also where you want to go afterwards. That's probably more important going to the more senior levels, but the panel will want to know, okay, what you're going to be at the end of this, where you want to go next. Have you got the right training in there to take that next step? Because they're looking to develop someone who's going to hopefully be a research leader of the future. So they will be looking at your career trajectory and where you're going next. So that leads on to the last bit. Be clear where you want to go. It needs to be obvious what you're going to use this fellowship for. It isn't just a research project. It's a fellowship to develop you. So it's got to be obvious what impact that's going to make on your career, as well as being high quality research. And if in doubt, and through any of this, we will say ask. I've said several times, any questions, please get in touch with the office. So phone, email, we're happy to take questions. Just the last couple of the slides now, I just wanted to show you the new NIHR website and where you can find more information about all of this. So that slide I showed you at the beginning is on our new website, and there's a link to all the programs down the left-hand side and guidance notes from either current open rounds or previous rounds, so you can get a good idea of what's involved in each level. This is also the place where you can find out who's been funded in the past. That's just a screen capture from the online application form, so each of these sections down the side represents a different part of the form, so it can give you an idea of the amount of different sections that are involved there. So this is just taken from the CV, so obviously detailing things like your degree, your past and previous positions, prizes, etc. So again, this is all online, and you can register for this at any time. You don't need to wait for a round to be open. So these things you can actually fill in whenever. So you could, if you're thinking of applying in October for the fellowships program, you can go online and start filling in these bits before the rest of the form becomes available. I just want to mention research for patient benefit very briefly. Obviously, it's not something that's run through our coordinating centre, it's run through another part of NIHR. But we have been doing quite a lot of work with research for patient benefit over the last couple of years to try and encourage more trainees to think about applying for research for patient benefit award either during or on completion of their current fellowship. It does represent what we think is quite a good grant to apply for as your first grant as a PI. And we've been doing various things to try and encourage this. It's been talking to research for patient benefit panels to try and get them to understand that if someone's coming through, say with a doctoral research fellowship as a PI for a research for patient benefit grant, then not to look at that as someone who's too junior if they've got the right support available. So it's about getting the panels to look at the whole research team when applying for one of these, and not just the PIs. One of the things we've been trying to do. So it may be something to consider upon completion of a fellowship. If you're looking for your first grant funding, is research for patient benefit. So the website is at the bottom there for more details. And again, that's just a link to the new website where again you can find more information about the program. And that's it for me. That's our contact details there, telephone number and website. So please get in touch if you have any questions, but I'm happy to take questions now.
Thank you. I actually have quite a few questions. I'll try to organize them in my mind. We have one member of staff starting. She's an healthcare scientist, and she's interested in doing a PhD and doing it through the scheme, seeking funding. We think for her career it might be better to go for part-time. And possibly for either the 60 or 75%, I think. Now, one of our questions were, what are the constraints? If she managed to, if for example she goes for the 5 years, could she submit her PhD if she was really clever and the rest of the work allowed it? Could she submit it before the 5 years?
Some people do finish their PhD early. That's not unusual.
Because my understanding is, I did it part-time but to a different scheme, is that there's not really, there is some flexibility. It's not normally 5 years. It can be, I don't know, for example, 3.5 years, and between 3.5 years and 6.5 years, the window of submission. So I was wondering if there is any restriction linked to the scheme or not.
When putting it together, we say apply for one of the three options. So obviously full-time, part-time 75%, part-time 60%. If during that time you finish early, you may finish 6 months early, fine. We just end your contract early. That's not a problem. Also, what has sometimes happened in the past, someone may have come to the doctoral research fellowship having already registered their PhD, which is possible. When you apply for a doctoral research fellowship, you can't have been registered on your PhD for more than a year by the time you start it, but it means you could have done some work already and may not need the full 3 years, having done that previous work. The panel may say at interview stage, okay, happy to recommend this award for funding, but it doesn't need to be 3 years. It could be 2, it could be 2.5. At that point, we would make the contract obviously appropriate to that amount of time. So I suppose what I'm saying in a long-winded way is there was a bit of flexibility, but when applying initially, stick to the 3 options available.
Thank you. The second one is for the more senior, so for the postdoctoral. Because I'm thinking of myself in this case. I seem to be almost in between the two options of the less than 5 years, the 5 years. What is meant by significant experience? Because, when you've done it part-time, you might have done some publications and you've been attending some meetings, but it's different than when you are a full-time academic. I don't know, how is this significant defined?
The panel are pretty good at sort of judging where you've come from on your profession. I think it's probably fair to say, depending on your background, different professions will probably have different publication records than others, depending on where you've come from, etc. So I think it's important to sort of show where you've come from and where you want to go in your application. It's almost the panel says sort of telling a story almost. So it's not like they don't have defined criteria that says you must have 10 publications to apply for a PDF, 20 to apply for a CDF. It is very much each individual, and does it make sense as an overall application? So I think they will take into account things like, have you had a career break? Have you been doing 50% clinical, 50% research, for example? That's all taken into consideration.
Okay, and the last one. sorry, then the lectureship fellowship, is that open to healthcare scientists that are not clinical as well, so like medical physicists, or it isn't? That wasn't clear to me.
So in the previous incarnation of the program, it wasn't. It was they had their own healthcare science program, and for that you had to be NHS based, and you had to be either a statutory registered healthcare scientist if that was appropriate, or on the voluntary register if that was appropriate to your professional background. In this new program, this all-encompassing clinical academic program that HE have reviewed, the same people can apply to that from a healthcare scientist background, so that won't change. And there's a bit more flexibility in it. It won't just be NHS-based healthcare scientists. It will be the same eligibility in terms of host organisation as everyone else. So provided you meet that, provided you've got the required registration and you're going to be based in an eligible organisation, then that'll be okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. We've got two questions. The first is, I don't know if you know the list of additional professional groups that are going to be included, but I'm particularly interested in whether play therapists or social workers will be added at the master's level. Do you know that?
Social workers, I think Health Education England, I've not put them on the list. However, if they're not on the list, Health Education England have said they will review each one on a case-by-case basis. So it is, because it's Health Education England funded, it's those guys who sort of make the decision if you're in or not. So when we launch, there will be this list on the website, but also some little sort of catch-all at the bottom that says, if you're not on this list but think you should still qualify, please get in touch, and there'll be details of how to do that.
Contact Health Education
Yes.
rather than the academic.
Rather than us, yeah.
And secondly, this may be an obvious question, so I apologise if it is, but in terms of the clinical and senior clinical lectureships, the 50-50 partnership between clinical practice and academic research, what constitutes clinical practice? The reason I'm asking, for example, is I'm a nurse by background, and my clinical role is actually developing clinical academic careers and supporting nurses and AHPs to do research. So it's not directly working with patients. So it does that, but I'm employed by the NHS.
It should be patient it should be patient contact NHS service and development, yeah.
I've got a question about the new Transitional Fellowship. So you gave, as an example, people moving from biological science to applied health. Might that apply for somebody who, with a social science background, who's been working predominantly not in the health field, but wants to move into health services and health research?
Potentially, yes. It could. I think as long as you make a good case in the application form that you are making a real transition, and at the end of it are going to be competitive for further NIHR funding, then this award is quite flexible from that point of view. It was set up in mind originally with sort of looking at basic scientists moving to applied health research. But the first person we ever funded through this, just to give you an example, was a chemist by background. So their previous PhD experience and postdoc experience had all been in sort of very basic sciences in the form of physical chemistry. So it was not health research at all. But they were successful and managed to sort of argue in their form that they could use it for that purpose. So yeah, I think we'd take, it's the transition that's the important thing. Because we've also seen other people come in who've not really, it's not really been a transition. They may have just said, oh, I need a bit of training in this or a bit of training in that, and it's not necessarily been a transition. And if it has to be enough of a transition to sort of be considered.
Thank you. Sorry, a little supplementary question, because I've got the mic. Thinking about sort of showing your outputs thus far, is there any kind of, do you get a sense that there's a sort of weighting, WEIGH, towards outputs from your PhD as opposed to other outputs from other research projects, perhaps that predate your PhD?
I wouldn't say a weighting. I think the more you've got, the better. I mean, that's always going to enhance your application if you've got pre-PhD outputs. I mean, depending on the level of it, if you're applying for a postdoctoral fellowship and you've only just been awarded your PhD, you may not have many PhD outputs yet because it takes time to publish. Obviously, you might still be in the process of doing that. So sort of outputs previous to that shows that you've been quite productive in your research career, even pre-PhD, will be helpful. Whereas something quite senior, like the Senior Research Fellowship, it's going to be the more relevant recent publications that are going to be taken into consideration more then.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, thank you. I just had a question about the numbers you put up, about numbers of applicants. Is that numbers of people who made it through to the interview, or total numbers applied for each of the fellowships?
These, let's go back to them.
Just to get a sense of the competition. Yeah, these numbers.
Yes. So the top number is applications, so not based on, nothing's been taken out there. No, nothing's
Oh, I see.
been
So it's not those that you haven't filtered those who've made it through to the interview. That's
no, yeah, this is just who applied. So some of these, so the 185 applied. Some were lost at eligibility.
Okay.
Some were lost at shortlisting. Some were lost at interview, and 34 ended up being funded. Oh no, that's just my bad maths. Sorry. No.
Hi, I was just asking about advice about applying to other schemes in addition to NIHR and what you should say on your form about that. So say you were thinking of applying both to a clinician scientist and Wellcome Fellowship, etc.
There's a section on the form which says history of previous applications, and it says on there, please detail any previous applications or current applications to other funding bodies. And there's various questions on that. Is it full? Is it outlined? Do you know the date that it's submitted? All that, etc. Any feedback you've had, how you've addressed that. We don't have any rules in terms of applications elsewhere stopping you applying from us. I know other funders do. So I know MRC probably take a different view, that if you've applied to us already, you can't then apply to them. We don't have the same one in reverse. So I'd say talk to your other funder that you're applying to as well to see what their rules are around it. In terms of us, there isn't any rules in terms of how many times you can apply or how many concurrent applications you can have. The only one there is you can't have more. You can't apply to more than one level of fellowship at the same time. But eligibility should stop you from doing that anyway. But just in case you could. Yeah.
It was about the NIHR Clinician Scientist Fellowship. It was 4 brief questions. You didn't mention a success rate for that. Secondly, are there part-time options similar to the others, i.e. 75, 60? And thirdly, is there a sort of guidance over appropriate clinical work, or can it be any clinical work for that fellowship?
So success rate, to answer the first one, is, I didn't put it up, but it is sort of similar ballpark, so sort of around 20% success rate. In terms, sorry, what was your second one again?
Are there part-time options?
Part-time options, sorry. Yes, there are. It's 5 years. It's like the SRF. It's 5 years duration, whether done full-time or part-time. So it doesn't change the duration, but you can do it part-time. And in terms of the clinical, ideally it should be linked to your research. So but it doesn't have to be. It's clinical service, and it's basically 4 sessions to do your clinical, to do your clinics. I think if it's linked to your research, then that probably makes the application as a whole look better, you know what I mean? But there's no sort of restrictions on that.
And there's a lot of people who work part-time in my organisation work 4 days or 3 days. That's obviously 80% or 60%. Why is 75 one of the options? It seems a bit strange.
It was based traditionally on the fact that it takes a 3-year award up to 4 years, basically. So over 4 years, it works out as 75%.
Okay. And can I ask one final question, which is overarching? What is your view on people who do their PhD in an institution and then wish to stay for the next phase? But there's also this expectation for some of the fellowships that they would then continue to employ you afterwards, which is looking like a sort of lifelong commitment. What would you have to demonstrate to show that there was going to be some change in your learning environment, let's say?
I think in terms of moving, it probably makes whatever makes most sense for what you're going to do. I think plenty of people do move having done a PhD. to somewhere else. It might make lots of sense to do that, and as long as that's clear in the form as to why you're doing that, I think is the key thing there. And in terms of ongoing support, I think you may move at the end of a more senior fellowship. Again, that might be entirely appropriate, but I think what the panel are looking for there is, we have had examples where someone has been supported from their host institution for the duration of the fellowship, and then come the end of it, they're basically let go. And of course, it's difficult for an institution to give any guarantees of ongoing support. They can't really do that. So they're not expecting to have a guaranteed this person will be employed by us for the next 10 years. But it's more, is the institution supportive of clinical academic careers as a whole? Is this person going to be in the right place to actually sort of nurture them through? So I think whatever you're going to do, as long as it sort of makes sense to you in your career within the application, I think that's okay. It's all, there's no sort of one size fits all, if you know what I mean. It's got to make sense for you and your research.
But you don't prejudice against people?
No, no.
Hi, my question's about the statement around evidence of commitment to a research career, and for a postdoctoral fellowship. And I know we spoke about publications, but can you give some examples of how it's judged? And
I mean, a lot of it there's a part of it within there in the application form which is relevant research and experience, and that sort of is in addition to the research plan, and there they probably be looking for the fact that what you've done already, actually a lot of it's just what you write actually in terms of where you want to go next, what are your career aspirations afterwards. So after you've done your, say if it's a postdoctoral fellowship, what's the next plan, after that, what you want to go and do. So I think they'll get most of that through how they see how what you've said you're going to do next, basically. So I know you can't map out your career and how it's going to be for the next 10, 20 years, but to give some sort of indication as to what you're aspiring to do, I think if you can get that across in the form, then they'll see that actually, yes, this is what you want to do. And when you get to interview, I think when I said about the sort of trying to show your personality and your enthusiasm, I think that actually can come across quite well in the interview itself, in terms of actually this person is clearly engaged in the research they want to do. It's clear they want to pursue this as a career.
so it's more about the ongoing plan rather than what's already been done.
Yeah, I think it probably is a bit of a balance, but obviously depending on where you're applying and where you're coming from, that is going to change. I think it can. The whole feel of the form, I think, some panel can probably pick out someone who's not really been involved in research at all up until now, and is just thinking, "Oh, I'll have a go at this." Whereas it's someone who has obviously had some previous research experience and making it obvious in their application where they're going to go to next. I think it does come across quite throughout the form.
We'll just take a couple more questions.
Hi, my question is about the research project within an application, and I'm wondering what your appetite for risk is within those research projects.
Good question. The panel want to see you be challenging yourself, so they don't want to see a sort of risk-free project that you can easily deliver this. At the same time, as I said about what's in scope for a fellowship, they don't want to see of something which is clearly never going to happen. So I think it's a bit of a woolly answer, I know, but I think it's a balance. You want to be pushed. They want to be confident that there's a good chance that you're going to deliver this, and that varies depending on the person. So for example, if it's a stellar candidate who's got a great track record, and they can see in their application this person's got delivered on lots of previous applications and grants, etc. And that is coupled with what looks to be quite an ambitious project, they may be then more confident of recommending that for funding. Whereas if it's someone who, the candidate's okay, but just across the line, but they've got some concerns about certain areas, give them the same project, they may think, actually, that is too much of a risk given this person. So I think they will take into consideration your fit with the project as to how much risk they think it is, if you know what I mean. It's if that makes sense.
Thank you. Just a question regarding the start of the doctorate fellowship. Is there any particular reason that it starts in January, February, or March, at least for the clinical scientist, instead of September or October, that usually all PhD programs start? So that creates a little bit of a administrative mainly issue.
It's mainly really about sort of spreading the various programs we've got throughout the year, really, in terms of where, for finance reasons, where they're based, you know, where payments are going to be made, and also in terms of actually spreading the workload for the office. You know, it's quite a small team that manages all of these things, so we obviously can't launch everything all at the same time and everything closing all at the same time and contracting all at the same time. It wouldn't actually be feasible for us to do. So we sort of take the year as a whole and sort of plan when things are going to launch and close, sort of, so it's a fair spread throughout the year, really.
Thank you. That's the last question.
I've got a few small ones, if that's all right. In terms of someone being a returning applicant, so are there particular things that you'd be looking for in that intervening period between having not been successful and coming back for more?
It might sound obvious, but address the feedback that the panel have given you. I think even if you don't always agree with it, which is sometimes the case, that you might get feedback from the panel and you might think, not quite sure about that, but that's the first thing the panel are going to look at with the returning applicant. They'll go to that section and go, okay, did they act upon what we said to them last year?
But the feedback that, in my experience, the applicant receives is all the reasons they were shortlisted. There's no feedback from the interview, the reasons that you didn't get it.
There should be some interview feedback you should get. Some people get more than others, because some it's really obvious. So some people may fall down on a particular thing. There might be some really obvious flaw in the methods, which otherwise the project would have been okay. And they will put that in the feedback. So you should, in terms of the shortlisting feedback, obviously that is the comments from the two panel members who assess your application at shortlisting. You get those whether you're successful or not. At interview, we do try and give all candidates at least some feedback from what the panel said. So it will be to try and address how that's changed. If you have applied before and think you've not had enough feedback, I can discuss with you separately afterwards. But everyone should get some feedback so that they should act upon. Yeah.
The other thing was, is there any advantage in dovetailing doctoral research alongside some already funded NIHR research in terms of kind of added value with that of the project, that kind of thing, impact?
We do see examples of that where, say the supervisor has a large trial through one of our other programs. It might be, say, through HTA. And as part of that, there's a small but distinct piece of work which could be used as a fellowship application. If you do that, the important thing is that fellowship is still owned by you. It's a standalone piece of work, so it shouldn't fail if the HTA project doesn't get funded or goes wrong in some way. You should still be able to do your fellowship, and it should be obvious that you've got ownership of that as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. Okay. The last thing is, I know what I'm doing is relevant to the NHS, but I'm not planning specifically to collect all the data within the NHS. So from NHS-based patients, thinking about faith groups, community groups. Is there anything important about in the kind of scope about the setting? Am I going to be judged on where I'm getting the data from, or is it more about the impact for the NHS? Yeah,
not necessarily where you're getting it from. I think the importance is it going to benefit the NHS going forward? And I think if you can demonstrate that, then that sounds okay to me. Yeah.
Thank you.